So those manuals are just one of the issues raised in a new book by Deborah Davis. She studies environmental effects, especially cancer risks. She's even shared a Nobel Prize with Al Gore. Her latest book reads like a conspiracy thriller, full of nasty plot lines. She accuses the cell phone industry of covering up the dangers. I met up with her in Washington and started with the cautions in those cell phone manuals. So what does that mean that this is in here?
It means that if you use the phone like that, you're not in compliance with the standards.
But why don't they put it on the phone? Who's going to read? I didn't even know this was in here.
Well, when I testified before the Senate, I called for warnings to be put on phones. Most people do not know that a cell phone is a small microwave radio. Most people do not know that microwave radiation at low doses over long periods of time has been linked to a variety of biological impacts and damage.
In fact, just this spring, headlines after a huge research project from the World Health Organization told us not to worry. But what about the Interphone study?
Among the Interphone team of investigators from 13 countries, some of the people aren't talking to one another. There's a big disagreement in that group.
Davis says there are two big problems with the Interphone study. There's a conflict of interest because it was partly funded by the cell phone industry, and that most of the research doesn't look at heavy users, and the small parts that do found a doubling or even quadrupling of tumors. So are you suggesting science is for sale?
It's more subtle than that. I'm suggesting that scientists always need research money. We do. And if you're getting paid very handsomely to do work, and you get to go to very nice places to present your findings, there's a kind of series of subtle incentives that are operating.
But enough to not find an effect, to say, no, there's no effect?
It is more complicated than that, frankly. But sometimes you can set up a study so that it's designed to fail.
In her book, Davis says when negative effects are found, the cell phone industry goes out of its way to hide it. It's something I've heard before in stories that I've done here at CBC. In 1994, in Seattle, Henry Lai, with his study on rats, was one of the first to report that cell phone-like radiation damages DNA, seen as a first hint of cancer. When his work was reported, his funding dried up.
If 3.5 years nothing happened, you wonder what's going on.
A few years later, the head of the U.S. body that figures out how much cell phone radiation is acceptable reported a problem. When Om Gandhi published a report showing the brains of smaller adults and children absorb much more radiation than that big man Sam, his long and profitable ties with the defense and electronics industry came to an end. In Davis's book, Gandhi is quoted as saying, "Anytime there's evidence of an effect, there are many others brought in to show that there is nothing." Also in the mid-90s, the Canadian and American cell phone industry gave a Washington-based scientist named George Carlo $28 million for research. He spent years telling people not to worry, until the end, when he says his study started to show there was an effect.
When they found that we had findings of genetic damage and increase in the risk of cancer, they cut off our money completely.
Then, in 2002, Franz Edelkofer, who had been chief of research for the tobacco industry in Germany, was given millions of euros by the EU to test the hypothesis that cell phone exposure is safe. Edelkofer was shocked when results came back showing genetic damage that was 10 times more likely with the new, more powerful 3G phones. A few months later, Edelkofer was accused of fabricating his results. He's now battling what he calls an industry smear job. We reached him in Munich, Germany.
Mobile phone industry has taken over some methods used by the cigarette industry in the United States for many, many years to hide the truth.
You're suggesting a massive effort to make negative science go away.
It's not that hard. The first thing you do is you don't fund the science at all. It's really tough to do research. And there are lots of important questions we can study. So why would anybody in their right mind want to go into a field that's dangerous to get into?
But still, many do. Health Canada says the weight of evidence from animal, cell culture, and human studies does not indicate that the energy emitted by cell phones is strong enough to cause serious health effects. Well, what about cancer? We did our best to find all the lab studies done around the world in the last 2 years on whether there is any link to cancer. We found about 15. Almost half did not find any harmful effect, but a bit more than half did. Check this out. 2 studies from Italy and 1 each from China, Turkey, India, Austria, Croatia, Sweden, and Germany, all showing a biological effect from cell phone radiation.
So you're afraid this could be as bad as tobacco?
I think it could turn out to be worse than tobacco for one simple reason. We've never had a situation where all people smoked. Today, around the world, almost all people are using cell phones.
But cell phones have been around for a long time and we're not seeing any big spike in brain tumors.
That's true, but cell phones have not been around for a long time with heavy use.
My involvement in this project or issue began in 1993 when, following a lawsuit that was brought by a husband whose wife had died of a brain tumor, there were congressional hearings mandated in the United States. And during those congressional hearings, it became clear that cellular telephones, which at the time were being used by 15 million Americans and about 50 million people around the world, had been exempted from pre-market testing. In other words, cellular phones were not tested for safety before they were put into commerce. The reason for this, as came out in the hearings, was that the cellular phone industry had received this variance from the Food and Drug Administration based on the recognition that cellular phones transmitted at very low power, and that at the time, the only mechanisms of harm that were known had to do with heating of biological tissue, to wit, microwave oven studies. And based on that low power exclusion, cellular phones were exempted from any type of safety testing before they went into the marketplace. I was the person who was charged with running that program. I was given $28.5 million in 1993. The money was put into a trust. An interagency government working group was put in place to oversee the work. At the Harvard School of Public Health, we enlisted an independent peer review board to peer review all of our work at the protocol stage, at the data analysis stage, and at the final report stage. We went forward with that program with more than 200 doctors and scientists from around the world participating. In 1999, we came forth with our findings, and there were several findings that we did not expect. We were able to confirm, for example, that cellular phone radiation, near-field radiation, caused leakage in the blood-brain barrier. We identified for the first time genetic damage caused by non-thermal radiation. That genetic damage was exhibited by the presence of micronuclei in human blood. We also found in our epidemiological studies more than a doubling in the risk of neuroepithelial tumors among people who use cellular phones when compared to people who did not use cellular phones. At the time we had these findings, we went both to the Food and Drug Administration and to the cellular telephone industry, and we suggested strongly that they let the public know what was found. Their response was that they didn't feel that the data were strong enough to warrant a public warning. Thank you for your work. We'll take it from here.
And a very sophisticated program was put in place to allow the industry to distance themselves from the findings of the research that they themselves had funded. They hired people to plant stories on the internet that discredited me and the other 200 doctors and scientists who were involved in the program. Over a period of time, the criticisms were showing up in so many places that I had to write a book to answer not only those criticisms, but to make clear what actually happened.
And now this is a brain cell of a rat, isolated from the brain of a rat. This is a DNA ball that forms. There's some fragment coming out because the DNA is constantly being attacked and break, and of course the cell can repair. Now this is a cell from a brain cell without radiation. So you can basically form a very spherical ball. Now, this is two cells, two DNA balls after exposure to radio frequency radiation for 2 hours. And you can see the fragment coming out from the ball. The more fragment, the more damage, right? So let's go back. All right, it takes time. So this is without radiation. This is with radiation. So you can actually count the, you can use a computer program to count how many fragments can come out from the this DNA ball, and then you will see the then it gives you some kind of quantitative measurement of the effect.
Didn't one of the cell phone companies, Motorola, didn't they directly respond to your study?
Well, actually, the people from the Motorola company did send some people to our lab and look at what we're doing and things like that. But well, this is there was at that time we did not know what happened, and actually there was an internal memo that leaked out from Motorola, and the memo basically tried to find some way to discredit our results.
As well as other members of the industry, I understand that someone contacted both NIH and perhaps someone else contacted the University of Washington president at the time, trying to get you fired for that?
That's true, yes. Mm-hmm.
So I have to imagine that was, that must have been somewhat surprising to you.
Yes, actually that was actually very stressful too, and it was surprising because we're scientists and we're never involved in all this kind of political and so it's kind of a very stressful time after we published the paper.
Henry Lai's work has been done 14 years ago, the first time. It was similar things happened to him too. He was accused too as if his work would have been nothing but rubbish. And we can say our data support his findings, while our data have been obtained in vitro in the laboratory. His data have been obtained in living animals and are even more important as compared to others. But both set of data, his and ours, support the epidemiological finding, give them credibility. That
the radio frequency radiation work that we did was supported by Motorola. The relationship was really very cordial and very stress-free, but only up until we started generating data. These folks were very, very upset and began to talk about how are they going to handle this, what sort of spin can we put on this, what can we expect from this, and from that point on the relationship changed. What we saw was that Motorola began to exert more and more control over the work, telling us what to do, telling us how to write abstracts, what to say in the abstracts, what to say in the papers. I said, how to do the work. No, don't do this. Yes, do it this way. This was unacceptable. I had completed our study of DNA damage, and I submitted the final report to Motorola, and I got a call from Mays Swycord at Motorola. Now, Mays is the former head of the Center for, CDRH, Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA, and he left the FDA and went to work for Motorola. Keep that connection in mind. That's interesting. He also handpicked his successor at the FDA. Anyhow, Mays didn't like the work. Then there was another phone call. Point is, I kept getting nothing from these people. They simply weren't willing to accept my interpretation of my study, my evaluation of my study, my knowledge of science at that point, and tried to urge me not to publish the study. They didn't tell me not to. They just said, no, this isn't ready for publication. And they wanted me to do more work. I stopped taking calls from them, and I went ahead and published the study. It came out in 1998, and I wanted nothing more to do with any Motorola-related work. I wasn't going to put up with that kind of control. I wouldn't put up with that attitude.